Afternoon, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to my medieval sewing party. I know it has been quite a while. All messages, yes. Okay, I know it has been quite a while since we've had a good sewing party, and hopefully today the live streaming gremlins will not foul up our attempts to have a wonderful, engaging time. So I've been very, very busy despite the fact that I haven't been live streaming. Been doing a lot of sewing and a lot of research into medieval fashion, more readings into medieval daily life, because there's always new information coming out, always new sources. The learning never ends. And as promised, we shall start with a getting dressed. And the way I'm getting dressed today, some of you, my regulars, you know this, but for those who are new, the getting dressed today is going to be peasant attire from the 15th century. So we'll start with the getting dressed and then we'll go on to the sewing party. Today's going to be more of a medieval crafting party. I'm going to be doing a lot of finger loop braiding because at the moment I have no sewing projects that I can actually do by hand on camera. So I have to kind of get to a certain more stages. We're also going to be discussing progress in my current 15th century sewing projects and news in my big historical Korean clothing research into 16th and 17th century hanbok. So as always, if you have questions, pop them in the live stream. For whatever reason, I am not seeing any live stream at all, any live chat rather. Pop them in the live chat. And if you're enjoying, please, hit the thumbs up by double tapping the screen and consider subscribing. Okay, everyone. So starting off, one very good question. And since I'm getting dressed like a peasant today, I thought I'd commence by addressing what is a peasant. The word peasant, oh, fantastic. Susan, thank you for confirming that there is actually life out there. What is a peasant? A peasant, the word peasant in English, comes from the French word paysan, which just means someone from the country in its origin, from the countryside. But it's the word that actually just means farmer. And peasants, it's not a socioeconomic status. It's basically it's a kind of career field. It's a job. It's a job description. So you can have peasants who are subsistence peasants, subsistence farmers. They're poor practically, right? They're living on the edge of survival. But you can also have peasants who are of the middling sort, who live a comfortable life, but not terribly luxurious. And then you do have plenty of peasants in the Middle Ages who achieve wealth to the point where where various city-states and polities across Europe, starting in the 13th century, start passing sumptuary laws, laws regulating luxury goods that specifically address the purchase, use, and wearing of luxury goods by peasants, by yeomen. That's a kind of land, that's a farmer, right? That's a non-gentry farmer. So we know that the word peasant doesn't actually mean poor in the least. So I just want to make that clear. But the way I'm going to be getting dressed today is, in fact, the way you often see peasantesses, female farmers, when they're out in the fields working. But it also seems to be the casual at-home in private quarters ensemble that noble women in the 15th century probably donned when they weren't going out into the public spaces in their castles and palaces and their great halls, when they were just staying in their private quarters with their closest companions and engaging in letter writing or sewing or crafting or embroidery or something like that. So yeah. So welcome everyone who's joining us. Susan has a question. Would you say that the earlier Pastons could be called peasants? No, they were not. They were not farmers. As far as I know, the Pastons started as clerks or something like that. I don't recall that any of. Oh, for God's sake. Sorry about that, everyone. I got a bloody phone call that answered itself in the middle of the stream. How exciting is that? Okay. Anyway, no, the Pastons don't seem to, they don't seem to come from peasant stock. They're not working the fields. As far as I understand, they're actually clerks. And they actually climb the socioeconomic ladder through their connections in town and by getting on city councils and whatnot. I haven't looked back to their earlier origins, so, don't hold me to that. As always, I'm much more interested with the details of daily life than, specific timelines of specific lives. So, yeah. Twitchy, good morning to you, my dear. Good middle of the night, shall we say? Yeah. Okay. So the way I am dressed now is in a smocka in 15th century English. And then we got a good question about peasant wear in general, and specifically to 15th century Italy. But the question actually really does apply to sort of all of medieval Europe. And the question was, would peasant women and peasant men, by correlation, wear the same things, that the same layers that their socioeconomic betters would have worn? And the answer is sort of. In the sense that they would have worn the same number of layers, yes. Would the layers have been exactly the same in terms of tailoring and cut? No. Because for certain, for instance, 15th century Florence, or Bologna or Venice, the ladies, the patrician ladies, because there are technically no noble women in those places, the patrician ladies would have worn a smock, a camicia, they would have worn a gamora or a cotta, and then they would have worn another layer over top of that that would generally have a train, and it would be very fancy. And it would not be very practical for anyone who lives in a village or lives on a farm or works on a farm to wear as a top layer. But they would have worn a top layer. It just wouldn't have been quite as, it wouldn't have had a train, it wouldn't have been as voluminous in fabric. But in general, yes, peasant women would have worn a smock, a camicia, a gamora, a kirtle, and then a coat or a gown over top of that, some other layer over top of that. But it would have been cut in a way that would be pragmatic, practical, and suitable, appropriate for their, not just their station in life so much, but for their function in life. So that, I thought that was a really good question. But, you know, you do absolutely see depictions of farmers, peasants, men and women working in the fields, wearing nothing but their smocks, in some cases, their shirts. In the case of the men, their smocks, in the case of the women. And sometimes the women are wearing a kirtle, which I'm about to put on, and you can see that it's been kilted up over a belt so that they have free movement of their feet. So, but yeah, if they're out working in the field, no, they're not going to be wearing all 3 or 4 layers of garments unless it's winter, unless it's cold, then they would. But in the summer, no, of course not. Peasants, people who work in fields are subject to fewer rules of decorum than people who, you know, occupy and rule over great halls. So, yeah. Definitely middle of the night. Oh, Cassandra, welcome back. Thank you for joining us. Blue Dragonfly, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to my sewing party for those just joining. So I'm starting with my medieval getting dressed. And as I was just saying, this is the smocka, as it is in 15th century English. It's linen. They were also sometimes made of a linen cotton blend or a hemp, especially in Italy. Hemp garments were actually pretty common amongst the lower classes, not so common amongst the upper classes. And cotton is actually much more prevalent as an undergarment fabric than in Italy, for instance, in the Mediterranean, than it is north of the Alps. But it wouldn't have been a cotton that most of you would recognize. The weave would have been heavier, more linen-like in its weave, nothing like the fine muslins or calicos that you can get these days, or the kind of cottons that are turned into quilts these days, right? It wouldn't have been like that. Okay, so let's go ahead and go on to the next layer. The next layer is the kirtle, spelled at least 20 different ways in 15th century English, which can make text searches, digital text searches, very annoying, because clerks tend never to spell things the same way twice if they aren't forced to. And they seem to never be forced to. So there's that. How would palaces, Sarah, welcome, nice to see you, my dear. Sarah says, how would palaces and estates be decorated in the 15th century? What would be the regional variety? Oh my goodness, yep. Architecture is highly regional, especially in the 15th century. So it also depends on where you are. If you're in a city-state like Florence or Bologna or San Gimignano, or a city, San Gimignano, Pistoia, right? Those walled cities in the Italies are very densely populated, and they build tall, massive skyscraper tower houses. You can still see some of these have survived in towns like San Gimignano, and Bologna has 2. as far as I know, only two of its original medieval tower houses left, and one of them is about to collapse, it looks like. So, yeah, they were basically medieval skyscrapers. We're talking 12, 14 stories, but narrow, very narrow in some cases. The Palazzo d'Avanzati in Florence is a prime example of medieval exterior and interior architecture in Florence from the 14th century. It has been restored to its original 14th century state, and it has the most gorgeous frescoes on the inside. So the interior of most, and this is true of most of medieval Europe, no matter where you were, before the Reformation, because the Reformation broke Europe in so many ways, and it broke it artistically as well. But most interior spaces, whether religious, whether sacred, whether profane, whether secular, it didn't matter. They were covered in bright wall paintings, right? And then on top of that, when it gets cold, they would hang tapestries. So we're talking brightly colored spaces, not these bare stone walls that you see now, because most of those medieval buildings are in ruins or have not been maintained to their original medieval glory. You know, most medieval churches in Europe that are still standing were damaged massively by the iconoclasms of the Reformation, where plaster was literally either ripped off of the walls or they were just whitewashed, where statues were torn down and intentionally destroyed, where stained glass windows depicting people and saints and religious scenes were destroyed on purpose because it was considered idolatry by some of these crazy Reformationist sects. Right? So you should imagine that medieval interiors in general, and this is true for all of Europe, and I don't often say that, but it is, were much more colorful. And that includes even at the lower echelons of society. Even your average lower class person who maybe just has a little cottage, a little hut, you know, maybe has a little tiny apartment in town. The interior would be at the very least whitewashed, and they would probably then do some accents in red or blue. And we have evidence of people who don't have very much leaving in their wills drop painted wall hangings. So like the cheap version of a tapestry. Tapestry is a weave, right? It's not a kind of thing. Tapestry is actually a weave. So basically they were painted wall hangings. It was the bargain basement version of a tapestry. And we know that simple potters who didn't have high incomes, laundresses who die, and then in their wills, they actually leave behind things like painted wall hangings in the 15th century. So interior spaces were not dark, they weren't gray, they weren't depressing. Even at the lowest echelons of society, we knew they were at least washed in lime, which would have made them white and bright. And then they were often painted. Now, maybe if you're, you know, a potter, you're not going to be able to afford to have Botticelli come and paint your frescoes for you. But you can afford to pay one of your local painters something, or maybe an exchange of goods perhaps, to have them put some simple paintings on your walls. And some of these have survived in these, what we might now consider a poor person's home from the Middle Ages. So it's not supposition, right? We know this. So yeah, the medieval world was much more colorful than Hollywood or even the Victorians wanted us to believe it was. Yeah. You know, and then of course, in terms of exteriors and shapes, the way in which homes were shaped in the Middle Ages was highly influenced by the kinds of political circumstances in which they found themselves, which is why in medieval Italy you have those crazy tall tower houses, because most of the city-states in Italy throughout the Middle Ages are in a near constant state of civil war. They are constantly going at each other, factions, families, you know, basically these families are like the mafia you would imagine now. They really aren't that much different. They would have their own private armies, their own private soldiers. They would go after each other. They would attack each other. And so they eventually started building these tower houses where the door was 2 or 3 stories up, and there would be a removable set of stairs or a removable ladder to access it. So that's why these tower houses were built so tall, because they didn't have big footprints, but they wanted to make sure they were well above the fray, as it were. Whereas, you know, when you go further north into Places like France and England, you don't really get that kind of tall architecture because you don't have the same clan dynamic happening, or you've got these families that are just always fighting for power and going at each other constantly. It's a different kind of power struggle, not quite as constant and not quite as family based. So, yeah, but depending on where you were, you could have very large great halls or not so large great halls. Very often, kitchens were actually on the top floor. And that's because you don't want to put the kitchen on the bottom floor, because if the kitchen is on the bottom floor and it catches on fire, which happened more often than we might like, then the whole building will go up in flames. Whereas if it's just the top floor and it catches on fire, then hopefully you can save the rest of the building. So that's a big difference and something that a lot of people don't expect. Yeah. Question, were blankets manufactured during the Middle Ages, or was it a cottage industry? Blankets, when you say, I need more clarity for that. When you say were blankets manufactured, manufacture is a word that can perhaps have connotations of machinery. The Industrial Revolution doesn't happen until the 18th century, but there are still in the Middle Ages some machinery that is either wind or water driven. So for instance, they had water mills that could drive hammers for smithing, and also for fulling of wool. And sawmills also were water driven. But if you're just talking about were there people who specialized in producing blankets? Yes, absolutely. There were absolutely blanket makers. There was, medieval, especially the later you go into the Middle Ages, the more specialized professions become. And so, yes, blanket makers are a special field. Quilt makers are a special thing. But I just want to be clear, we're not talking about patchwork quilts. We're talking about 2 layers of fabric quilted together over padding, usually to create patterns and shapes and scenes, right? Not patchwork quilts. I have no evidence of patchwork quilts in the Middle Ages. Doesn't mean it wasn't done. I just haven't seen patchwork quilts myself. I've seen intarsia, but those aren't necessarily used as bed quilts. Those seem to have been wall hangings. And intarsia, fabric intarsia, is a technique that seems unique to Scandinavia, whereby they would basically cut out a series of shapes from alternating colors of fabric, like 2 colors, and then they would swap the colors into the frame so that you'd end up with a black dragon with a red frame and then a red dragon with a black frame, right, all the way through. I haven't seen that evidence of that outside of Scandinavia, though. I've seen one extant one from 15th century Scandinavia. So yeah, blankets it was a professional industry, absolutely. And there were different kinds of blankets, right? There were different degrees of blankets. There was wool that was specifically made, woven just to serve as bedding, as a blanket for a bed. It was not intended to be used on clothing that would come in contact with, human skin with any kind of closeness. And there are blankets, and then there are blankets, right? So at the upper echelons of society, I'll go specifically with the 15th century, but it didn't start there. You would have a silk bedspread, basically, that was lined in fur. And you can actually see these depicted especially in scenes of the birth of the Virgin or the birth of John the Baptist, especially in paintings by the Dutch masters, right, the Flemish masters. So, there were blanket making was absolutely a profession, and there were charitable institutions all across medieval Europe operated by the church. Were called hospitals, but the word hospital does maybe too much thinking for us modernly. In the medieval era, a hospital was not just a place where people could get medical care. It was a charitable institution that provided, yes, quality medical care, quality by medieval standards, to anyone, no matter their status in life, for free. They would also provide job training. They would provide homes and livelihoods for orphans. They would raise orphans, basically. They would also provide food. They offered food for the poor and clothing for the poor, right? So they would also therefore give out blankets. That's one of the things they would distribute on a fairly regular basis. But yes, it was in general, in most places, blanket making was a profession, but there were different degrees of blankets. Sheets also. And fabric was also special woven for sheeting, right? So linen was specifically woven to be made into sheets. And we have expense accounts with just massive orders for sheets and also laundry bills for sheets. And, you know, it's always coming from a specific producer. In general, women seemed to be involved in the production of linen goods, including sheets, including linen undergarment, including undergarments. That seemed to have been, in many places, women's work. Whereas tailoring and the sewing of garments, like this one you see here, seem to have fallen under the purview of men, except that recently I found a fantastic word, shapester, in 15th century English, and a shapester was a female dressmaker, not a seamstress. Seamstress is in medieval English, a sempster, a sewster was someone who just did the sewing, not the dressmaking, not the patterning, not the tailoring. A tailor was a man who did the pattern making, who made the shapes, who took the measurements, who drew up the pattern pieces, and maybe even cut them out. But then that would actually be a sempster or a sewster or a sewer who would actually then sew the pieces, put the seams into the pieces. But then I recently found the word shapester, shopester, in medieval English, starting in the 13th century, I think. And that was apparently a dressmaker. So a female tailor, someone who actually did the measuring, the patterning, and the cutting, the design of the garment. So I finally found evidence of women being involved in that aspect of clothing production at a formal level. Yeah. Oh, that's a good question. I have been to the cloisters in Yonkers. It's not in Manhattan, technically. I have been to the cloisters many, many times. Many, 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 many times. I grew up going to the cloisters, and that might be why I have such a love for 15th century art, clothing, and architecture and aesthetics. Yeah, I've spent a lot of my life at the Met. I won't prevaricate. That's a place I have spent a lot of time. Oh, are you braiding the tie into my hair? Yep, sorry about that. Yes, you got me talking. So yeah, here, I'll demonstrate it again. This is the way I actually do my braids all the time, not just when I'm doing medieval stuff. I actually take a finger loop braid or a ribbon, doesn't matter, could be either. Finger loop braid or a ribbon. And I braid it into the hair. So finger loop braid. And so I start braiding the hair like so. And then as we work our way down, depending on how long it is, because I need to have enough to finish tie it off, right? I then align one strand each with one strand of the finger loop of the lace, as it's called. And then I just braid that in. And this way, it never falls out, ever, ever, ever. And I don't have to use any elastic or plastic or petrochemicals or anything that might really harm the environment. So this is actually how I braid my hair every day. And I don't actually have evidence that they did this per se in the Middle Ages. The depictions, the very few times, and I do mean few times, not in the Middle Ages, that's too broad, in the 15th century. We have evidence that they did this in the 12th century. But in the 15th century, all the depictions I've seen of braids, the very few times you see the ends of the braids in France and England and the Low Countries, there's actually just a really thick cloth band, which probably is not a silk ribbon, but linen, because it would fall out if it were silk. And it's wrapped around and around and around, like two pieces wrapped around and around and around to create a really thick end. But my hair is not thick enough to actually tolerate that. So I braid it because it just falls out. So I just braid the lace into my hair like that. Now, I should emphasize that we don't have a plethora of depictions of women's uncovered hair in the 15th century, and by which I mean real women, not biblical women or women depicting goddesses or something like that. So there's a lot of open ends, a lot of questions about the details of 15th century hair styling and how women actually achieved the look that you see, because it's just not often depicted. And when it is depicted, it's a little disturbing. And you sometimes have to wonder how accurately it's being depicted, since it's nearly always men doing the illuminations, the miniatures. And since it is very often trying to depict a specific thing, which might be trying to make a point with how the woman is depicted, and not actually representative of how women generally did the thing, if that makes sense. When you were little, did you read The Mixed Up Files of Mrs. Basil E. Frankenweiler? Nope, I did not. I've never heard that. I've never heard that before. When I was little, I read Shakespeare. Yeah. Twitchy says, in regards to the word shapester, I wonder if it was simply a difference in gender terminology, with both doing the same job. You mean shapester and tailor? Maybe, but seamer, and so we actually have a male. Semster is a sewer is the male version of semster, of seamstress. So we know there was a male version, and it wasn't a tailor, right? So I think shopester, I think shapester is the female version of tailor, is what I think it comes down to. And it's funny because the word charge of shaping the garment, of giving it form rather than of the construction itself. It looks like you could put one braid on each side of that headdress. Was that ever done? Great Aunt Elizabeth, do you mean like putting it over, putting on each side of the headdress? You mean like here in the back? Yeah, absolutely. You could, fill it in the back 100%. That's the beauty of this kerchief, is that it's completely flexible for amount of hair that you have. Yeah, and also we do have depictions of women having like rings of hair where they take their braids and they actually tape them to their head using ribbon. That is seen as well. So that is an option as well. But when I'm just getting dressed down and dirty by myself, this is how I do it. Yeah. Twitchy says, I'm glad I'm not the only one who had a ridiculously high reading ability as a kid. Yep. Yep. I was already reading books by myself by the age of 3. So, yeah, I didn't read very many children's books as a child. I was reading a lot of history books from our shelves. I was reading classics and Shakespeare and that sort of thing. I read the real Phantom of the Opera, not the young adult version, when I was 9. So, and that's, I was reading Edgar Allan Poe and those sorts of things. So I didn't read many young adult novels or children's books. Yeah. Yeah. The Hobbit, yeah. I read The Hobbit as a little girl too. My dad was a big Tolkien fan. I guess that shouldn't surprise anyone, huh? My mom thinks Tolkien is boring. My mom's a bit of a Philistine when it comes to fantasy, though. She definitely doesn't get the beauty of Tolkien's writings. But I guess that also may have pre-programmed me to become a linguist because Tolkien was a linguist. In fact, many of you may or may not know, but Tolkien resented having students because he resented that it took him away from his research work and his writing. Yeah. Okay. So let's bring you up to speed on some of our projects. I'm going to show you where we're at on our cat fur covered so-called Burgundian gown. All right, so let's go ahead and pop this on. I've basted in the sleeves because I'm going to show you my process for testing sleeve caps. So I do my own patterning, and I have very muscular shoulders. I have a muscular body, and you may have noticed I have very square shoulders. They're very muscular. They are not soft and squishy at all. And I've got some really nice muscular definition right here. And so this can be problematic for me when it comes to an arm's eye in the sleeve cap. So I have had lots of problems in the past designing a sleeve cap that doesn't drag my neckline down. This one does, for instance. If I were to actually undo the stitches here, which I'll show you my process there, and insert a piece, this would actually stop trying to pull itself off of my shoulders. But that's because I have these silly muscular shoulders, and always have. I've always had overly muscular shoulders. Even when I was 9, I remember I went into the nurse to have the scoliosis check, and she was, palpating my shoulders. And I remember her saying, it doesn't help me to go do an accurate test, Rachel, when you're wearing shoulder pads. I'm like, first off, how many 9-year-olds are wearing shoulder pads? But I looked at her and I said, those are my shoulders. And the expression on her face was priceless. Not shoulder pads. Which also means that any garments that I buy that have shoulder pads, I must remove them, or the shoulders pads sit like up here because I have such muscular square shoulders. Okay, so here we go. I'm just putting on. Oh, I still need to finish. I still need to properly attach the cuff lining on this one because. Okay, so it's going to pop a couple of pins in here so that, okay, so until I put this black layer on, I was basically dressed like a peasant, or what I like to call, I'm a 15th century nobleman cosplaying a peasant. Cosplaying, not a new concept. Ancient peoples across the world have cosplayed. The Romans were fond of cosplaying their own history, for instance, or doing reenactments of their own history. So, noble woman cosplaying peasant was not invented by Marie Antoinette. So ultimately, I'm going to be putting lacing rings in here, but there's a couple of changes I think I'm going to have to make. Fitting, nothing big in the body, just some fitting things. It's just a little too, it's more voluminous than I would like it to be on the sides. And I'll show you here shortly. Yeah, okay. These are pins that we bought in Florence 3 years ago after I literally ran out of every single straight pin in my collection. Over the years of traveling and bringing my sewing with me, the pins had just all fallen out and I had not a single pin left in my home. And we got to Florence and we found this Twitch, you'd love this place. We found this fantastic embroidery supply shop in Florence, and they actually had silk embroidery thread and it's silk embroidery floss. How many shops actually have that in stock these days? But they also had these beautiful pins. They're just so gorgeous. They're thin, they're long, they're really well made. I love these things so much. So every time, I love practical souvenirs. Every time I break out this pin box, I remember that wonderful shopping trip in Florence. Yeah, yeah, you do want to go to there, Twitchy. Okay, so it's pinned in. The sleeves are on. And so a couple of notes. When you are patterning a garment or fitting a garment, you need to make certain that you are wearing underneath everything that you would be wearing when you wear that garment. A lot of, especially beginner sewists, make the mistake of sewing a garment like a dress that's actually the top layer and trying it on over their very thin modern clothes. And then when they go to put on the actual proper underlayers, then it doesn't fit anymore. So first thing, make sure you start, if you're going to start a new wardrobe in a new era, start with the bottommost layer and work your way out. Do not start with the pretty top layer. I know the top layers are the exciting ones for most people, but you really want to start with your underwear first. Okay. And for those just joining, welcome to my medieval sewing party. Don't forget to double tap that screen and consider subscribing. Okay, so this is actually a little big in the waist. My waist is actually here. So I'm still kind of deciding whether I want to, unfortunately I already finished all the seams. So I would actually have to unfinish the seams, which I did by hand, and redo probably from about, take it in from about here to about there is probably where I would take it in. And I'm trying to decide if I want to do that. This gown will never be worn like this. It will always be worn with a belt though. So I'm not certain it's really worth the effort of taking in the seams a couple of inches, or if I'll just leave it kind of this looser, but still following my curves silhouette. Yeah, I'm still debating on that. But in the meanwhile, we can look at the sleeves. So I will show you here. You can see that actually this has pulled, so this should actually be here. This seam, I know it's black on black, so it's hard to see, but this seam should actually be here. So the sleeve cap is of the arms, the sleeve cap of the sleeve is pulling the arm's eye. It's warping it in this direction, which is not what we want. We do not want that. So what I'm going to do, happily, there's actually a lot of extra sleeve cap on this, so we don't have to add a panel. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to cut the basting stitches because I just basted it into place. For those who don't know what basting is basically thread glue. Basting is what you should do anytime you're hand sewing anything. First you pin, then you baste, long running stitches, and then you pull out the pins, and then you go back over the basting stitches with actual proper stitching, right? And so when I'm doing fittings, basting stitches are the way to just check the fit of everything before committing fully to an actual proper seam. So we are therefore going to take these snips, and what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to, the spot where I specifically feel the pull, right? The spot where I specifically feel the pull is where I'm going to snip the threads. And what that should do is it should release this, the arm's eye, to sit back to where it should. And then I can mark where the seam should actually be on the sleeve cap. Yep. Could you not take the finish seam on top of the finish, like make a little flap inside? Great, on Elizabeth. Yeah, you could do that, but it would be bulky. So you really don't want to do that. You want to unfinish, you want to pull up. And the other thing is that because it's so curved, you're going to have to make little easing stitches anyway, or it's not going to lie flat. Easing cuts. Because otherwise this deep curve will not lie flat. It will not actually get close to the thing. So you're going to have to take it out anyway. It's not a big deal. It wouldn't be a big deal. It's just I'm kind of want to be done with this because I need more clothes. In the next 5 weeks, I have to get a whole bunch of gowns done because almost all of my gowns have completely worn out and I look like a ragamuffin now, which a Contessa shouldn't look like. So yeah, basting stitches are big and sensible. My most frequently missed step. Yep, it is. Basting stitches are really the way to go. Okay. So you can already see how just by releasing that, it's already sitting differently. Yeah. This is a very important aspect of these arms eyes, is that you make certain it is actually, this is the trickiest spot. Honestly, this spot right here is the trickiest part of an arm's eye, is getting it to fit properly when you're doing your own patterning. And on me, almost no commercial patterns work for this part of my body. They also don't work for my waist. I always have to take in big time on the waist because strangely shaped body. Here we are. Yep. No, it's a great question, Aunt Elizabeth. It really was. Okay. So you can already see that this is sitting back here, and this arm's eye. So in general, what I think has happened somehow, when I basted it on, I actually basted it on too far back. So it actually needs to come forward. Like I need to rotate the whole sleeve this way. So that's one of the benefits of basting to test first, is that you just baste it in loosely, really long running stitches basically, and then you can test it out before committing to something like an actual seam. So yeah, basting for the win. And then on this side we have, actually it already started undoing itself. I didn't do that. It undid itself. It showed me the way. It showed me the way. And we basically have the same thing happening where I've actually sewn the sleeve on a little incorrectly. This center seam needs to come down to about here. Right. So, and that is why we baste, ladies and gentlemen. So that's where I'm at on this dress. I'm basically at the fiddling with the sleeves phase because this was a new pattern. This was a new pattern I worked up, and it's generally working really well. We have completed, as I showed in the post, you all noted all the cat fur, that's still there. You can see the finishing here, the facing. And I had a good question about the facing that I thought I would take the time to address here. The question was, is the strip for the facing, is that cut on the curve or is it bias cut? It is neither. And in the original pieces that I've seen, they are neither cut on the bias nor are they a curve, meaning, like you actually cut the shape of the hem. Cutting the shape of the hem would be extremely wasteful in fabric because you'd be cutting into the fabric in a very inefficient and wasteful way. But also you have to remember that fabric in this era isn't 60 inches wide or more. Not even broadcloth was. And so you'd have to have a lot of little curves that you cut and then cobble together versus just one long rectangular strip that you can get just by cutting the edge off, possibly even with a selvage. Okay, now the reason not to do bias cut strips for your facing. I've tried that. I've experimented with bias cut strips for the facing. It doesn't work out at all because of the way the bias works. When you try to fold it, it ends up being weirdly wrinkled when you try to do this part of it. It doesn't lay flat, nice and flat at all. It ends up very unsightly. So then the question is, well, then what about the fact that the panel of your skirt is angled, so the further up you go, the narrower the space gets, but the rectangle is a rectangle. So you just address that by taking little mini tucks, because you're doing whip stitches to finish to attach the band at the top part. Right? So you just do little whip stitches that capture little tiny bits, little tiny gathers, not mini tucks. Yeah, mini tucks, mini gathers, right? And that's how you gather up the excess on the top. And that actually helps create a little bit of stiffening, because that bulk of taking all those little mini tucks all the way above actually helps the skirt stand out from your feet, which is great when you're trying to walk. Yeah. Making 3D fitted garments from 2D fabrics is not simply sewing; it's a feat of engineering. Yeah, no, it's absolutely true. Yeah, when you are patterning is an art, and I have an eye for how 2D shapes can turn into 3D shapes. Not everyone has that skill though, which is why not everyone can make patterns, which is why, thank God, there are commercially available patterns. I have, however, never seen commercially available patterns for my particular areas of interest that exactly replicate what it is I'm going for, but also they don't tend to work for my body. Yeah, I usually have to make crazy big adjustments anyway. Yeah. Oh, Mike, you've tried making chair covers, for instance? Yeah, that's super three-dimensional. Okay, so are there any questions about the Burgundian gown, as I think it was probably the Victorians that started calling them that? I'm not certain where that term came from in the costumer circle. But otherwise, I'm going to take this off in the hopes that I can minimize its exposure to cat fur, and then we will get on to the crafting while I discuss some things that have been kind of floating around in the comments, and also share some of my latest research with you all. Yep. How do you learn how to make patterns? Cassandra, I don't know where you learn. I taught myself. I wish I could answer that. Okay, no, that's not true. I do know where you can learn. You can take fashion design classes. So fashion design classes will absolutely teach you the fundamental of patterning, 100%. Will it be medieval patterning? No, but patterning is patterning. So no matter whether it's exactly the way a medieval garment would have been shaped in its pieces, the fundamentals are still the same. So if you really want to learn to make your own patterns, then you should take a fashion design class. And specifically, you want to focus on one that teaches patterning. They do have them. Some community colleges even offer them, depending on where you are. It kind of depends on where you are in the world also. Because depending on where you are, there might be symposia or workshops. If you live near a chapter of the Society for Creative Anachronism, then they might actually have workshops on patterning. If you attend this 2-week reenactment is absolutely not the right word. This 2-week medievalist fair / living history-ish event called Penzic that happens in Western Pennsylvania at the end of July and early August, there are literally dozens, if not hundreds, of classes on how to pattern. So, and those are all free as part of your admission into the event. So, it depends on where you are in the world. But yeah, in general, you want a fashion design class or to study fashion design. And that will give you a real leg up on patterning if it doesn't come naturally to you. I taught myself most everything I know. because I lived very remotely. I started doing this when I was like 13, making medieval clothes. And that was when there was nothing on the internet, and we didn't even have internet back then. But there was still would have been nothing worth seeing or helpful or useful in the early 90s. So I had to teach myself almost everything. I basically just started cutting shapes out of fabric, and it somehow magically worked. I don't know, it's a gift in my case. Yeah. Yeah, so yeah, Morgan Donner has a video on, yeah, Morgan Donner's video is decent for a kirtle. You know, but hers is based on blocking. So yeah, there's different ways to pattern also, right? There's different ways to create patterns. The cat says, I'm actually practicing hand sewing now because I was before I was only on fashion sketches since I was little, so why not try sewing? Yes, cats will be cats, exactly. Just jump right in. You know, there is, and I will tell you everyone, there is a graveyard, a vast graveyard of fabric in the wake of my creative journey of autodidactism when it comes to sewing. So you just have to be willing to make mistakes. You have to be willing for projects to be useless, to go nowhere, to die because they can't be salvaged. And that's part of the process. That is absolutely part of the process. Yep. Yeah, Morgan Donner has a kirtle patterning video. The medieval tailor's assistant has really good written instructions for doing a body block and how to adapt the body block for certain basic, you know, sort of 13th through 15th century English garments. So, you know, there's also a couple of like those resources, but if you really want to like really learn the true art of pattern making, then you want a fashion design class. Yep. Okay, any other questions about this gown, the Burgundian gown? I'm going to be making a removable pin-on collar that will actually be made from the silk velvet of the cuffs. Because right now it's just the silk turnback collar, but I'm going to make a collar that from this exact same silk velvet that will be basically this shape and go over top of it and can be pinned on. And then if I want to do a different collar, I can take it off. Or if I want to have no collar and just have the nice black satin turnback lapels, then I can. Okay, moving on to our finger loop braiding. And if you're just joining, welcome to my medieval sewing party. Thank you for joining us today. If you're enjoying, don't forget to double tap that screen and consider subscribing. So is anyone else working on anything in particular? Oh, what does blocking mean in this context? Sorry, a body block is basically the shape of your body in your torso, more or less, in fabric. A body block is a sort of like the base you in fabric that you can then take those pieces and use them to make other garments with some changes and manipulation depending on the specific garment. It's called a body block. So to block your body means to basically you take 4, maybe just 2 rectangles of fabric and you pin it onto your body until it is the shape of your body. And then you cut those pieces out and that becomes the foundation for all future garments. And then you just change it to match the actual seams and lines of each individual garment. So it's a very important step to, you know, when you're starting the journey of making your own garments, body blocks are a really useful thing. Some people, you know, it depends on how you learn too. Different people learn in different ways. Some people are good at watching a video and picking things up. Some people need it in writing. Some people prefer just stationary pictures. Some people need to be in person and actually be guided step by step. So depending on how you as an individual learn, that will determine which of these resources might be the most useful. Yeah. So yeah, body blocks are absolutely a great way to start your patterning journey. And the Medieval Tailor's Assistant shows how to do a body block. Morgan Taylor, she's not really making a body block. She jumps right into patterning the kirtle itself. But her kirtle isn't really, it's not a 15th century kirtle. The gown she's making is more late 14th century in terms of its shape and the things it's doing. And curdles do, they change in shape and they change in how they close over from the 14th to the 15th century. So there are differences there, and there's differences in the shapes and the kind of way it's trying to shape the body, because, you know, where the bust line should be, you know, whether it should be buttons in the front or whether it should lace close, the kind of lacing, the sleeves, that all changes over the 100 years or so. That is, well, from the 14th to the 15th century, because the kirtle keeps evolving past that. By the end of the 15th century, the kirtle actually gets a waist, and the skirts are separate, and they're sewn into the waist of the bodice. And that's when you that's the birth of the, what we'll call the Tudor kirtle, for lack of a better word. But that's not until the very end of the 15th century that happens. And I suspect, I have a suspicion that it's Spanish influence that causes that, because in Spain, Spain and Italy start doing separate bodices and skirts in the early 15th century. And it's Spain that has a really big influence in the English court at the end of the 15th and into the early 16th century, as some of you may be aware. So I suspect it's the Spanish influence that leads to the kirtle becoming a separate bodice and a separate skirt. Yeah. I'm knitting the begonia swirl shawl and procrastinating binding off my Dance Macabre shawl. Nice. I like your style, Cassandra. I feel that to my core. Oh, goodness. Yeah. Okay. So we had a really good question in the comments a couple of days ago, and it reminds me that my audience is so beautifully international and very multicultural, because things that those of us in the United States and Canada and in Europe take for granted, knowledge, understandings of our shared history that we take for granted, other people, say, from Pakistan may not understand. So one of my followers, Haas, I don't know if you're out there. If you're not, if you're watching this as a recording, shout out to you, my dear. He asked me in my video, I made a post or the shrine video about the shrine of Henry VI, and which was a place that people with mental health issues would visit in the hopes, especially if they were suffering from madness, in the hopes of being cured. And apparently many were. But he asked, why is it, in this case, the English, why is it Henry I, Henry II, ... through Henry VIII? Why don't they just name their children something different? And at first I thought, well, this is a silly question. But then I thought, wait a minute, maybe it's not silly. Maybe this shows that I just take it for granted that, of course, you're probably going to name your child after you. As a tend to name our children after ourselves. And one of the psychological theories is that it's a way to gain immortality, right? It's because if you give your child your name, then a part of you will live on in them, and so on and so forth. At the level, of course, of dynasties, it can give you legitimacy as a ruler if you are connected to previously successful rulers. So, you know, and very often it's not until later on that kings start naming their children after their crown princes after themselves. It's just that very often the firstborn seems to die, and one of the later sons, is the one that's named after their father, and that's the son that just happens to take the throne, right? So that seems to happen sometimes as well. You know, in the case of Henry VIII, he wasn't supposed to be Henry VIII. He was just supposed to be, you know, he should have been the Duke of York, right? He should have never been Henry VIII. It was supposed to be King Arthur was supposed to be next. So, you know, naming your children after yourself in general, I think is about, you know, it's kind of a sense of immortality, and someone, you know, maybe also hopefully, if you're a good person, imparting some of your own legitimacy and power onto your children. But it is very, 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 very common to name our children after ourselves or after our grandparents. And after the grandparents, there are some theories that has, at the dynastic level, that has to do with dynasty building and conferring the qualities of the great ones who came before onto your children, who will hopefully then take over and be equally great. But there's also you know, on the lower level of society, there could be a thought of, well, I really loved my father, so I would really love to name my son after my father because in a way I'm keeping him alive in that manner. So again, it might come back to immortality. Yeah. Yeah, rest in peace, Arthur. Yeah, Arthur. And this also brought me to the idea that the name Arthur for princes in England is a cursed name. It is such a cursed name because Henry II names one of his many sons Arthur. He dies in battle, right? Then we have Henry VII's son, Arthur, who's supposed to be the once and future king. I know that they specifically named him Arthur because they were hoping that that would, you know, create this great emotional bond. It would help unite the kingdom, which had been torn by civil war for decades at that point. That it would point the English people in a new direction together. And then he goes and dies of sweating sickness at the age of 16. So after that, I don't know if there were any Prince Arthurs in English history, maybe later on, but it does seem to be, it seems to be a cursed name somehow. Yeah. Okay, well, I have now detached the sleeves, so let us go on to our finger loop braiding. Maybe I'll go ahead and pin this in now while we're sitting here chatting. So I thought that was an interesting question. It also made me check my assumptions about my audience and about general practices and what people generally understand. So yeah, thank you, Haas, for that. Now, while we're talking about sewing, I also wanted to talk about padding, padded garments in general. So in Europe, we've been padding garments since at least, and I mean civilian garments, since at least the 13th century. I haven't looked back further than that to see just how far back, you know, the practice goes. But starting in at least the 13th century, I have men's and women's garments, not arming garments, civilian garments that are padded and quilted, no doubt for warmth. But the kind of padding that they would have used would not have been like our modern batting. So modern batting is usually needle bound. That's not the word I'm looking for. Needle felted is more the word I'm looking for. It's basically needle felted. It is made into a pretty thick, dense pad that's uniform and that you can easily cut. But not that there's a lot, but all of the extant padding that I have seen from, say, the 15th century, none of it, when you actually do get to see it because the garment has worn away, that's not the style of batting. They didn't have that. That's been created by modern machines that now can do that to the cotton wool. That isn't how it used to be. No, I'm not going to do this while talking to you. I'll do something really wrong. I'm going to put this aside and we're going to go to finger loop braiding because I can finger loop braid mindlessly. I shouldn't be working on my Burgundian gown mindlessly. So where did the loops go? Batting, cotton padding. I had it all made up. Well, okay, I guess I'll make a new set of loops. I had a set of loops all made up, and I think the cats wandered off with them, as they are wont to do. Kitty, stop taking my fiber arts. Anyway. Oh, I didn't bling up. Yes, must put on a little bit of bling. I know this is definitely the noblewoman cosplaying as a peasant right here. This is how you know it's cosplay. when you put on a jewel like this with your kirtle. 15th century noblewoman cosplaying as a 15th century peasant. There we go. Right. So the kind of padding that they would have had seems to have been more like roving, that would then be padded, quilted in between two layers of fabric with quilting stitches to hold it in place. And I say this because we're working on a new farsetto for Stefano, for my condottiero. Ryan, as some of you know him. And I was examining the only two extant farsetti doublets that have survived from the 15th century. And they've only survived from Italy. And I was looking specifically at the padding in Pandolfo Malatesta's farsetto. He was the Lord of Rimini. He died in 1427, I think. And he was interred in a gorgeous red velvet farsetto. And it has survived remarkably well. Well enough that the lining, the padding, the interlining, and the shell have survived in large chunks of it, which is remarkable. Because in the case of Diego di Cavaniglia's farsetto, almost none of the lining and none of the padding survived. Only the shell survived for the most part in the farsetto. So when I was looking at Pandolfo's farsetto, what you can see, happily, because the lining has worn away and the shell also has worn away in various spots, you can see the fibers that make up the padding, and they're very loosely laid in. It is not a needle felted layer. It is not a felted layer at all. It looks like they laid layers of roving, which is basically fibers that are ready to be spun. They've been laid out into long, long lengths and wrapped into hanks, wound into hanks, but they haven't been spun yet. And they've just been laid in and caught between quilting stitches between the layers of the lining and the interlining. And in the case of Pandolfo Malatesta's padding, it's fascinating. His is multi-fiber. He has silk, he has wool, he has cotton, and he has hemp, all part of his padding. And it occurred to me that that is actually brilliant because all of those fibers have different properties. And I expect that especially this much looser, less densely needled layer of padding would result in a padded layer that will breathe really well, because hemp and linen breathe super duper well. Cotton, wool also breathes really well, actually. Silk, it's decent at breathing, but it doesn't have the evaporative properties that linen and hemp have. And so you get all of the benefits of all of those different fibers in the padding all at once. And so I'm planning at this upcoming 15th century living history event that I'm attending at the end of July. There are several fiber vendors there who sell really Twitchy, you would love this event so much, and you would just go crazy with the shopping opportunities. But they have fantastic linen, wool, and silk roving. So I plan on buying, and hemp. So I plan on buying those, and then laying the next farsetto that we make is going to have those layers laid out and quilted. And we're going to see the difference in how it feels in terms of wearing in, say, hot environments. So I'm excited at that, but that's not what we have right now. So right now we went with what we have available, where we are and when we are, because we need to get this done sooner than later. And so we went with just modern cotton batting. But I would like to point out a word of caution about modern cotton batting. A lot of so-called 100% cotton batting has been treated to be flame retardant. And that means that it has been treated with chemicals that will make it much less breathable than it should be. And I should do a short video where I show you the difference between cotton batting that's been treated to be flame retardant and cotton batting that has not been treated. And how it burns also is very interesting. But even the so-called 100% cotton battings that have not been treated with flame retardant. Flame retardant is probably not an actual word. Even those, I just recently purchased one that is wonderful in every way, except it has an iron-on mesh stabilization layer that is not breathable in the least. And thankfully, it was really easy to peel it off. Thankfully, because otherwise we wouldn't have been able to use it. It would be unbreathable. I wouldn't even use this for blanket with that unbreathable synthetic layer on it. So you have to be careful with the batting that you purchase. They don't always label that, oh, by the way, yes, it is 100% cotton, but we put this iron-on stabilization mesh that is not cotton or anything even vaguely natural. So be wary. Thankfully, that layer I was able to literally peel it off with no damage to the cotton batting. But I would be very upset if I bought, say, I don't know, a quilt that said it was 100% cotton, but the batting that was used on the inside had that unbreathable layer. That quilt would be unbreathable. It would be hot and sweaty and not comfortable. I'm I'm not a time traveler. Galezzo. I am a practitioner of medieval living history, but I will absolutely take the compliment of time traveler. By the way, guys, don't forget to double tap that screen if you're enjoying. Okay, so I am about to do something that we modernly called finger loop braiding, but in the 15th century English, in medieval English, was called lace making. And I'm going to be making these. This is a lace. This is a round lace of 5 bows. Boas in the original 15th century language. That's what the word for loops was in this era. And this is made of hemp. And it's going to be used specifically for arming points. So this is going to be used for Ryan's new 15th century harness, which is looking really sexy, by the way. And this is the kind of lace that would be used to point his armor, to attach his armor to his arming garment, right? They didn't, for the most part, 15th century harness is not strapped onto the body with buckles and leather straps. It's pointed, it's attached to a fitted doublet using these points. The legs also suspended from this fitted doublet so that it fits your body like a glove. So you need a lot of these as a man at arms, as a knight, as a medieval knight. And this is usually it was actually women who made the lace. And then they were sent en masse to a pointer, a man whose sole profession it was to put metal chapes on the ends so that it would fit through lacing holes easily. So I'm in the process of making a whole lot of this, and I'm actually thinking of selling them to people who might like them. And we're going to be waxing them in beeswax, so that will add extra durability and strength and prevent them from fraying and breaking as they are wont to do. But we know that they were a consumable item because in the archaeological record, in medieval toilets also, we often find broken points that sometimes still have a knot in them, but they frayed and tore somewhere else. So we know that this was a consumable item. No one thought they would last forever. They're replaced regularly and all the time, so I'm making a whole lot of them so that Ryan has plenty for his kit. And I'm getting to the point where I think I've made enough that I can start selling them. So I'm thinking of selling these lacing points. And I'm thinking of selling not just arming points made out of hemp, but laces for dresses made out of silk. So if you think you'd be interested in buying such an item made by me, just let me know, and it'll sort of, if I decide to go that direction, help me decide whether I should or not. One of the things I love about medieval lace making, as you see me doing right now, is that it's a good workout. At least the way I do it, it is. It's also very relaxing. You enter this sort of trance-like space. Oh, fandom, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Tommy Core. I do not like the fake linen. Yeah, fake linen is terrible. Ugh, just awful. Right. Where did my little list go? I actually wrote up a list of things I was going to discuss with you all, and the list also seems to have vanished. Darn it. Okay, well, let me see what else I was going to discuss with you about sewing today. Oh, a new discovery on my part, everyone. Very exciting. For those of you who are into food history, to culinary history, and are interested in cuisines other than Europe, I have discovered the existence of not one, but 2 17th century Korean cookbooks written by women. And they have really amazing recipes in them, so delicious sounding, and in some cases very much not at all like Korean cuisine is now. So it really highlights just how much Korean food has changed. And one of them is by this amazing genius of Korea of the 17th century, who basically taught herself to read. She snuck into her father's library study and taught herself to read when she was like 5. And by read, I mean Chinese characters. So that's pretty amazing. And she wrote lots of different things. She wrote poetry, and her works were so admired by later male scholars that there's lots of mentions of her ability as a writer, as an authoress. And in the very patriarchal Joseon society, where it was not accepted for women to be educated, that says a lot about her skills and talents. This book is really interesting, though. There's a Google Arts and Culture English version of it available, but the English translation is real rough. It is not. It's very clearly an AI translation. It is not good. But I understand enough Korean to be able to realize what it is they're actually trying to say, because I know what all the usual pitfalls of translation from English or from Korean to English are. One of the very interesting things about her recipe collection is there's 51 recipes for alcoholic beverages. Apparently, it seems that then one of the things that this cookbook has provided information about is that just like in medieval Europe, where it was the women, the wives, who did the ale brewing for centuries, apparently in Joseon, Korea, at least in the 17th century, it was the wife's job to oversee the brewing of fermented libations. So she has lots of recipes with instructions for different kinds of alcohol. 51 different recipes. She also talks about food storage, about how to store different kinds of foods for long-term storage. And that's really useful in a pre-refrigeration world to see just how they did it. And it isn't just fermenting, believe it or not. And, you know, she has one of the interesting takeaways from this cookbook is that even the aristocrats did not eat much beef. The recipes, if you look at the meat that is covered in the recipes, pheasant, chicken, and dog are more common than beef is. And dog, I want to, before any of you get on the, oh God, dog, they weren't just kidnapping dogs wandering around the streets. There was still is a specific dog that was treated like livestock, right? That was bred specifically for meat. It was just outlawed here in Korea a couple of years ago, the production, sale, and consumption of dog meat. And it was given a 5-year phase-out period so that the restaurants that served it could retool, basically. But it's basically a dead culinary, it's a culinary dead end here in Korea now. Young people are not interested. But, you know, try not to moralize that too much in a world where famine happened often. You're not going to be too picky about the source of protein that you can get. But even in this noblewoman's cookbook, there's like no beef. It's pheasant, it's chicken, it's pork, it's dog. And that makes sense because cows were beasts of burden. They didn't use them for dairy. Dairy's was not consumed here. Koreans, I suspect, probably don't tolerate it very well, or didn't tolerate it very well, but they use them as beasts of burden for plowing their fields. So that was important. And also for pulling carts. So yeah, beef not eaten so very often, but the very fascinating combination of flavors, of really exotic flowers that are utilized in the dishes, all these roots and greens that even now aren't used very much in Korea, even though they still eat a huge variety of wild greens and herbs and flowers. But it's been very interesting reading this. One of the really fascinating things, though, is the hwajeon. Hwajeon are flour pancakes. And they are still making flour pancakes to this day here in Korea. Flour pancakes are made of rice flour and water, and that's it. And you make it into a dough that you knead until it gets stretchy. Glutinous rice flour. And then you fry it in, if you're doing it properly, in sesame oil. And then towards the end of the cooking, you put a flower blossom onto it, press it into it, and it kind of wilts into the pancake. Makes really beautiful, beautiful presentation. And at the very end, you drizzle a tiny stream of honey over it. Well, even though the recipe's simple, we should never assume that it dates back very far. Well, she has a recipe for hwajeon that is much more complicated, actually, than this modern recipe. Her recipe for hwajeon, for flour pancakes, involves a combination of rice and buckwheat flour, which I love buckwheat flour. Anyone else here love buckwheat? I love buckwheat. Buckwheat is so yummy. So she takes rice and buckwheat flour, and she actually mixes the flower petals into the dough instead of putting it on top at the end. So it would actually flavor the dough a lot more than just putting one little single blossom on at the very end. You would get a more consistent flavoring throughout, and I would bet you dollars to donuts that the 17th century cultivars of these flowers were much more flavorful than modern cultivars are, because modern flowers have generally been bred to be really big and beautiful, but that has been at the sacrifice of their scent. And I would bet that the 17th century versions, in her case, let me see, it was peonies, roses, and there was another flower. Peonies, roses, azaleas. Peonies, roses, and azaleas, all together, by the way, chopped up into the dough. And I especially in the case of roses, we know that modern roses, for the most part, have zero smell and therefore zero flavor. But I would bet that these 17th century cultivars were much more flavorful. So overall, that's going to result in a much more interesting pancake. So I'm very excited to try that. And I would like to see if I can maybe there's someone here on the Korean Peninsula who's actually growing heirloom varieties of those flowers, so I can actually try it properly. Yeah, pretty excited about that discovery. And all the other recipes that are just so very interesting. And, you know, it's very clear that there's an eye for beauty, but there's also a delightfully practical aspect to her writing. After this one recipe, which actually talked about using 15 different kinds of vegetables to make this amazing platter with pheasant meat in the center, she says at the very end, but if you can't get all of those things, don't worry about it. Use whatever it is you can get. And I just, that was such a delightful touch of human pragmatism that I felt really warm and fuzzy reading those words, because that's always my advice to people about sewing or cooking. You know, you work with what you can get. Don't break your head against a wall of impossibility. Work with the possibilities, right? Okay, questions or comments? I have Korean cold buckwheat noodles in my pantry. Oh, you've got naengmyeon, naengmyeon. I love Korean buckwheat noodles. They are delicious. Yeah, the question, what type of flowers would be used? In this case, in this recipe, it was peonies, roses, and azaleas. Now, but I know for a fact that there are a lot more flowers that are eaten here in Korea. And when I go out with my friends, I always ask them when we've pass wildflowers, which are kind of growing everywhere, even here in the city. Hey, is that edible? Is that edible? And they'll nearly always say, oh yeah, that's edible. We eat that, you know, at this specific time of year with this specific dish. Let me see. My friend, Yeonhyung Shik, is a flower importer at the Yeongjae Flower Market. Oh, that's cool. That's pretty cool. Go to the Yeongjae Flower Market in Seoul. Yeah, Seoul is not close. I mean, it's an hour and 45-minute to 2-hour, 20-minute high-speed rail ride, but getting around Seoul takes quite a while. Seoul is huge. Yeah, but you know, maybe the next time we're up in Seoul for a weekend or something, I'll go check it out. But here's the thing though, you have to be careful about flowers, guys. You can't just use any flowers in your food. You have to find flowers that have not been sprayed with pesticides and fertilizers, that have been basically raised for food consumption, because you don't want to be eating the garbage that a lot of these flowers get put on them to keep them pretty and perfect, which is why I prefer wildflowers. Out, wildflowers that are out in the forest or the fields, not right next to the road. How was the pomegranate chicken from yesterday? Oh, yes. The pomegranate chicken, the Romania. Okay, so for those who are wondering, we did a medieval cooking party yesterday where we explored a 13th century Sicilian pomegranate chicken recipe that really shows the interconnectedness of the medieval world. And it turned out so good. Oh, Cassandra, it turned out super tasty. Ryan had it for dinner. We served it with some saffron rice. And when I make saffron rice, I heap on the saffron. There is no doubt of the saffron in my saffron rice. And the saffron flavor plus the texture of the rice with this silky, silky pomegranate sauce and the tender chunks of chicken, which hadn't quite completely disintegrated, but were nice and soft and succulent. Really great combination with that the sour sweet flavor of the pomegranate juice. It was great. Now, how would people in 13th or 14th century Sicily or 15th century Italy, since the cookbook got distributed everywhere in the Italies in the 15th century, how would they have had the pomegranate chicken? I'm trying to look into that more deeply. How was it actually served? With what was it eaten? We do know that a lot of stews, and this definitely counts as a stew, that a lot of stews were often served with bread sops. And that's basically a piece of bread that is sometimes toasted. And the bread is sometimes put in the bowl first, and then the stew is ladled on top. And I know some of you, there's Lebanese food that's like that. There's a lot of Middle Eastern dishes that are like that as well. In Persia as well, where you actually you bake bread that's specifically for, or make bread that's specifically for this purpose of piling other food on top of it. And we know that they absolutely did that in medieval Europe as well, even if it's not included in the recipes. There are medieval books of etiquette that talk about table service, where they talk about when you are serving this kind of stew, you need to put out bread sops first and then put the stew on top of it. And we do have some recipes for stews that actually say, put bread in your bowl, then put the stew on top and serve it forth. So I'm wondering if this is one of those cases where it would have been expected to put some bread sops in the bottom of the bowl and then ladle the stew on top of that. I'm suspecting that might be. I don't have any evidence of rice being eaten in Europe the way it was eaten in Persia and is eaten in Iran and in India, where you have some rice and you have your stew and you eat them together. We have rice recipes for dishes like blancmange, but not as a side dish for a stew. So research is ongoing, but the dish itself turned out super yum, super duper yum. Oh, Ryan, hello, handsome. Would they have made bread bowls if they could? No, bread bowls are not, I have no evidence of bread bowls, but bread trenchers are a thing. So a bread trencher is a bread plate, basically, but a bread trencher was never made from fresh bread. Trenchers are prescribed as being made from 3-day-old bread, 3 to 4-day-old bread. Which they would have had, because at that point, the bread is kind of reaching a point of staleness where it's not really going to be particularly enjoyable to eat in the usual manner of bread, but you can still use it. So what they would do is they would take the loaf of bread and they would slice off the bottom. And they would cut it, depending on the size of the bread, they would actually cut it into like rectangles or squares, and that would be your plate. And we know they were doing this all across Europe up until the 16th century. And then at the end of the meal, very frequently, the bread trencher, which was then saturated by sauces and drippings, those were actually distributed to the poor. And so the needy people would actually wait at the kitchen door to have the bread, the bread scraps and the leftovers from the meal in some cases served to them. So bread bowl, not so much. Bread trenchers, 100%. Yeah, Sonia, welcome. Thank you for joining us. You managed to catch the live. And we also actually have instructions from, say, 15th century manuals of service. I'm thinking specifically Jack Russell's Book of Nurture from the 1460s that provides detailed instructions on how to serve a proper noble feast, a proper noble meal. And I mean detailed. You could really 100% accurately recreate a 15th century English meal of a wealthy individual, of a merchant or a nobleman or a king, by following his instructions. And I'm pretty certain the instructions are the same for more or less the rest of Europe in this era. And he actually talks about how to pair, in quotes, P-A-R-E, para, the bread to make trenchers. So he actually provides instructions on how to turn your bread into bread trenchers. And there's a difference in how you prepare your trencher, whether it's for the sovereign, your lord or your lady, or if it's for their guests. So that's a very interesting thing to read in that text. Now it's written in 15th century English, which can be impenetrable because 15th century English is not much like modern English. But there are in the edition that I have, which was by one of those great antiquarians of the 19th century, there's tons of footnotes and glossing to help with understanding. And there's now an online Middle English dictionary where you can actually go and look up words to help with your understanding. Some of you have been asking about medieval story time. I'm going to try to get back to our medieval story time as well. And I'm probably going to be doing a reading from John Russell's book of Nurture to further our understanding of daily life in the Middle Ages, specifically table service and hygiene, because he has lots of details on all of that in his work. Thanks for the soggy bread, you damn Richers. Yep, soggy bread it is. That is 100% what it is, soggy bread. But at least it's a very flavorful soggy bread. But to be fair, bread that's medieval bread that's 3 to 4 days old is going to be pretty dry. So the sauces and juices are probably not going to make it soggy. It's going to make it more normal. It will rehydrate it to make it pleasant to eat. It won't be disgustingly soggy. It was probably actually tasty, especially with all those different sauces and the juices from the roasts and that kind of thing. Yeah. Do you know why they stopped using trenchers in the 16th century? Is this a Reformation thing? They started using, as far as I can tell, if you look at the tables, they start using pewter plates, individual plates, and I don't know why. I haven't looked into why, Nevis, what the shift is. It could just be the natural consequence of technologies advancing, of becoming more efficient at producing pewterwares, the cost of pewterwares therefore going down, and people starting to eat off of the plates instead of the bread trenchers. I do seem to recall, now that I'm saying that aloud, I seem to recall that there's a famine. Not a famine. Well, yeah, there's droughts and famine in the 16th century as a consequence of that, specifically grain. There's issues with the grain supply, and so that may have actually reduced the availability of bread in parts of the 16th century, which may have forced people to, in Italy specifically, this happened, that may have forced people to look for other plate options. And metal trenchers were already a thing by the 15th century at the latest. But it seems my research into the use of metal trenchers seems to be that the metal trencher was actually placed under the bread trencher. So the metal trencher was actually more like a charger than a trencher itself, which, having used a metal trencher, that actually makes sense that you would use the metal trencher to stop juices leaking through your bread trencher into your beautiful we but you still have then the luxury of the metal trencher, but you don't want to eat off of metal for many reasons. And we figure it out eventually why you don't want to be eating metal off of metal plates when you're eating acidic food and the metal is pewter and it contains lead. See why Europeans thought tomatoes were poisonous. Yeah, metal changes the taste of foods, and medieval food, and even in the 16th century, this was still true, was really acidic. There was a lot of wine, there was a lot of vinegar, so it's just, those sauces, no, I really think increasingly that they weren't eating directly off of the metal trenchers, that the metal trenchers were just a luxury part of table setting to protect your tablecloth from leakage through your bread trencher. Was wondering if with the grain shortage changed practice. Yeah, exactly. So if you've got this grain shortage and bread starts getting much more scarce, then suddenly you might have to consider other options. Interestingly, and at least in Italy, I'm not certain if this happened in other places, they actually started replacing the wheat with rice flour because it was the wheat that was affected, the wheat harvest. And so they started cutting the wheat flour in their bread with rice flour. So it seems that people are actually eating a mixture of wheat and rice, and in some cases just straight up rice flour rice bread in 16th century Italy. By the way, don't forget to double tap that screen if you're enjoying, everyone. Hi, handsome.
Hey, baby.
Oh, yeah. So here is a replica of a 15th century metal trencher. And like I said, having eaten on it, I would definitely want, I think putting bread down first is a good idea.
Did you answer the question about kumihimo?
No, was there a kumihimo question? How long ago?
Not very long ago.
Okay.
Is it similar to this?
Okay, kumihimo. So kumihimo is braiding. It is lace making. The kumihimo loom, though, is an invention of the 17th or the 18th century. It's post-medieval. In Japan, they were also doing finger loop braiding, just like this. We have depictions of them doing it. They actually had a device, a cute little device, that would allow them to do super duper long ones while sitting on the ground. And it would actually, there was this little beater that attached to a string that attached to their foot, and they would jerk their foot back to cause the beater to beat the pattern down when the pattern was really, when the base of the braid was really far away. But yeah, kumihimo is just, it's basically, they invented a loom eventually, the Japanese, to take the place of the fingers. In the West, we went with bobbins. So instead of using fingers to create the patterns, we switched to bobbins in the 16th century. So you put the thread around the bobbins, and that's how bobbin lace was born. This is the origin of lace, of medieval, of modern lace, lacy lace, is this technique. And the technique got more and more advanced and complicated. They started making really complex laces, as they were called in 15th century English, sometimes using 2, 3, 4 people. And someone eventually realized that instead of having 4 people's worth of fingers, you could just leave the thread attached to the bobbin, to the spool, and manipulate the spools in a pattern that was pinned out on a pillow. So yeah, it's interesting how all across Eurasia, they had this technique through the Middle Ages, from ancient times going forward. And then eventually, in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, each respective end of the continent came up with different ways of doing it better or more efficiently. But yeah, kumihimo is not medieval. I know a lot of people get disappointed when I say that. They were just doing finger loop braiding in Japan before that. Like this. Looks exactly like this, in fact. So yeah, this is kind of the precursor to that. Let me see. Pottery was common. Oh yeah, pottery. Yes, ceramics were also common, but you don't see people eating off of pottery dishes. They had pottery bowls, but if you look at depictions of even lower class people eating, they're not eating on plates. They're eating on wooden or bread trenchers, interestingly. And I don't know why. I don't know why exactly they decided not to eat on, ceramic plates. We don't even have many ceramic plates. Most of them are bowls, like they're shallow bowls. And those were usually used for serving, not for eating. My abuela did bobbin lace as a hobby in Puerto Rico. Yep, Cassandra. And the bobbin lace is the descendant of this. And in fact, there are a couple of 15th century patterns for what we now call finger loop braiding that produce something that looks very lacy indeed. So you can really, when you look at those patterns, and then you look at later laces, you can see the connection much more easily than with this very simple workaday 5-bow lace that I'm making right now. Yeah, oops, sorry. Yeah, so let's see. It's going to talk about, I had some, darn it, my little notebook went, I had things all laid out. I really did. I had a notebook laid out. I had loops all ready to go to do finger loop braiding, and it all has just vanished. I really do have gremlins here. Right. So yeah, other interesting things that I've been exploring this week. My brain is going a million miles an hour because Dr. Minji Kim is back in town. And as part of my research into 16th century Korean clothing, we are going up to 2 museums on Wednesday and Thursday that have some of the largest collections on display of 16th and 17th century Korean clothing. And there's even a special exhibit. So I'm hoping to see pieces that I've only seen on Pinterest. So the adventure of recreating Korean clothing based on the actual extant pieces and how they were made continues. I've already reached some interesting conclusions based on the pieces that I've gotten to see in the museums. And I'm going to start production after Pennsic, when I no longer have an onus of time for getting 15th century European clothing done. I plan on actually starting to recreate the 16th century undergarments called joksam. I've examined two of them now, one of silk, one of Rami, and they were both constructed completely differently from each other, which is interesting, from the same woman, belonged to the exact same woman, found in her tomb on her body. And they're constructed completely differently, so I'm excited to make both of them. And when I showed my findings to Dr. Kim, to Minji, she was shocked at just how voluminous these garments were, whereas the woman was not that big. But 16th century Korean clothing is an exercise in conspicuous consumption, so they use vast amounts of fabric just because they can. Let's see. This explains a lot of words. Shoelace, lacing things up, tying a bow. Yeah, exactly. Great, Aunt Liz. So back to lacing. Yeah, so what we have here in my hands, these are boas, as they would have been called in 15th century English. The thing I'm making is called a lace, a lace, in 15th century English. And it comes from the French word lacer, which means to lace up a garment, dating that word enters English in the 13th century. And we have, you're right, it is preserved to the modern day, to the present day, in the word shoelace, which has, you might have wondered to yourself, why is it not lacy? And that's why. Yep, great, Aunt Elizabeth, exactly. Thank you for bringing that up. Okay, this is Stefano's current farsetto.
Project.
Yeah, current project. Done. Current project. It's in project, underway. It's lined in linen. It's padded in cotton batting and interlined in linen. Right now, it's just pinned together just for fitting, but we're going to make some adjustments here to where the shoulder seam is. So
padding.
And the padding. Yeah, the chest padding. His chest augmentation needs to be a little higher.
I didn't pad my boobs right.
He didn't pad his boobs right. So there's actually a debate in the 15th century men's clothing world, and specifically among men at arms mostly. So people who do harness fighting, about tight lacing. And yes, I am talking about tight lacing, not for women, for men. And there's a debate about whether the shape of the bodies that you see in the artwork is an idealized shape, whether it reflects an actual shape that their bodies were given, or whether it reflects the padding of the clothing to create those shapes, or some combination thereof. And there are some people who will die on the hill of tight lacing forever. They just made their garments really, really small in the waist and laced their bodies into that shape. Like, okay, I guess that's a possibility. And that's based on one quote. I think it's from Boucicault's work, but it also might be Geoffroy de Charny who writes that. One of those two great 14th century knights complains about the knights who tight lace to give themselves smaller waists. And so that one quote has been taken and extrapolated into all men must have tight lace to give themselves smaller waists. Did you want to demonstrate something?
No.
Oh, okay.
I was just going to say, I also put in the link to Gina B. Silkworks website for the TAC 5 bows depotted.
Oh, okay.
Because that's the best place to get it, as long as they have it in stock.
When you say put in, you mean in the shopping bag?
No.
In the
link should be published there, I hope.
Oh, no, it will strip links.
It.
Oh, then maybe it won't be stripped.
Yeah. It looked like it
usually did. Okay, did you all see the link for the Take 5 Bows Departed books? It may or may not. Sometimes we tried to put it in the live chat, but it might have gotten stripped. Yeah. Good morrow. Oh, Tommy Core. Okay, sleep well, everyone. Tinky plate. What am I doing? I am doing a technique modernly called finger loop braiding. It is lace making. I am basically making a lace that will attach armor to a knight's body, to the garments that the knight is wearing, called an arming doublet, or a farsetto in Italian. And for that, you need laces, which is where the modern term shoelaces comes from. So I'm basically making laces. and
Unless
in
you want
making
it topless.
making it out of hemp, because is that one of our cats or did that come from outside?
Yeah.
Oh, that is one of them.
It's Chimi.
Oh, is that Chimi? Does he want you to pet him? Oh, he wants to go into the room. If you hear him meowing, that's our cat Chimi. Was there a practical reason to tight lace, or was it a vanity thing? No, it wouldn't have been practical. It would have been a vanity thing. Oh, you know he doesn't.
I know.
He only likes to be held when he wants to be held. This is one of our cow kitties. This is
Now he gave
Chimi.
up.
Chimi has a sad but story with a happy end. Anyway, tight lacing. Was it a vanity thing or was it a practical thing? So having a garment, a knight wearing a garment that is fitted in the waist, as in exactly the shape of your waist, is practical because their leg harness, what we modernly call leg armor, was pointed, was attached to their farsetto, their doublet, at the waist or at the on the skirts, on the hips, right? So you want to have a tightly fitted waist that is tightly secured so that the weight of the leg of the leg harness is distributed through your body and that it doesn't end up on your shoulders, right? That weight is put onto your hips and then transmitted up through your whole torso and not just pulling down on your shoulders. If you don't have a garment that's very fitted in the waist and then you put leg harness on it, that's going to pull down from your shoulders, very unergonomic. So it is important that the waist be tight. However, that's not what Charny is talking about. He is talking about vanity. He's talking about, as he puts it, I think he even uses the word fat knights.
He does. I remember you.
He does. He uses the term fat knights who seek
tight lacing to look young again.
Yeah, fat knights tight lacing to look young again.
Instead of actually putting in the effort.
Instead of actually putting in the effort, which leads me to believe that normal men who were in shape were not tight lacing and giving themselves a shape they didn't have.
Which is why I'm going to the gym.
Which is why, speaking of tight lacing,
I'm going to the gym.
He's going to the gym. But that has been taken, that particular quote has been taken, and a lot of what I'll call modern weekend warriors or medieval weekend warriors have taken that as a sign that they should just tight lace their bodies or tight button their bodies into having the chalice figure that you see depicted in art from the 14th and the 15th centuries. I don't think this was, and some people even theorize that they started wearing those garments. It's the same thing with tight lacing in women in the 19th century. They started wearing those garments when they were little boys, and so it shaped their bodies into the chalice shape, so they didn't really even have to tight lace. Their bodies just assumed that shape. I, on the other hand, think that they achieved the shape through a combination of fitness, a fitness regimen that kept their bodies lively muscular, not bulkily muscular, and padding and shaping in the garments that gave them that shape. And then there's art that then exaggerates that to the extreme, just like it does for women as it does for men in 15th century art. That isn't how they actually looked. Their legs weren't actually up to their armpits. Their breasts weren't actually up near their chins. It's art. It's idealized, and it's depicting people in a way that probably no one actually looked. So I'm on the side of, I think that the garments maybe may have slightly pulled waists in where certain gentlemen had become too portly, but that for the most part, that shaping is achieved through tailoring and through padding of the garment. So that is a debate. I bet you wouldn't have thought that's a debate, but that's a debate. I could start a fire on my Creative Contessa wall on Facebook if I were to post something about that right now. And if I made a definitive statement in one direction or the other, I could totally start a fire. It's the same fire as with women and underpants in the Middle Ages, basically. Different group of people, same sentiment, same tenor. Mitia, welcome back. Thank you for joining us again. Cassandra says chalice shape, is that like being Dorito shaped? So chalice, a chalice like a glass, like chalice where it's sort of round at the top and then it gets very narrow and then there's a narrow spout at the bottom. So chalice shaped instead of not figure eight, not hourglass shape, because men don't have an hourglass shape because the hips are very narrow. Right? So they've got a rounded chest into a small waist and then narrow hips. That's referred to as the chalice shape. If you start looking at men depicted in their tightly fitted garments from especially the 14th and the early 15th century, you'll really start noticing this shape in particular. So imagine a chalice for drinking, right? Like communion wine, right? It's got this bulbous round shape that curves into a narrow spout, and then that stem, narrow stem, and then the stem kind of gently curves out, but is mostly pretty narrow as well. So that's the chalice shape. That's what people refer to that as. Yep. Fat knights like Lord Farquhar. Yeah, like Lord Farquhar, exactly. So my theory is that the pigeon chest was actually achieved in part by men having reasonably muscular chest, but the perfect pigeon chested shape is actually achieved through clever padding. And so we're doing that on Ryan's farsetto, and we need to the padding needs to be moved up. It's a little too low right now. So, and I've found yet more evidence that in 15th century Italy, the women's gamore and cotte were also padded in the bodice, because I found yet another trousseau inventory from 1466 for a lady, and it actually lists all the materials needed to make her cotta. All of them. It is absolutely I'm working on a translation. There's a lot of terms in here that I've never seen before. So I'm working on a translation because the current translation is garbage. It is hot, stinky garbage. So I'm working on a translation of it. And it actually contains in the list of all the things needed for the cotta. Cotta is just a fancy gamora. So the gamora would be made of wool or linen generally, maybe even hemp. It's the simple version. Shape is the same, but it's made of simpler materials without any kind of ornamentation. The cotta in Florence was the fancy version of the gamora. So it's got all the ribbon and all the trim and the embroidery and all the little fancy metal danglies all added on, right? So this particular list of items for her cotta includes banbaja. Banbaja is cotton wool, and it's just enough to pad a bodice, right? And this is the second time I've found it now in a list of materials needed to make a cotta. The first one was in for Caterina Parenti. Well, she wasn't Parenti yet, but the woman who would become Caterina Parenti, Marco Parenti's bride. Her cotta also includes an line item for bambaja. And if you think about it, think about the perfect pigeon chest you see on these Italian ladies, right? That perfect curve, how smooth it is. The second you pad that bodice with cotton wool, it's going to give you that look. And it wouldn't surprise me if there weren't some extra support built into the padding to position the breasts in just the right spot and hold them there. Right. So my next cotta, my next gamora is going to have banbaja, and it's going to have cotton wool, cotton padding, cotton wadding, and I'm going to shape it so that it is completely self-supporting with that, and that it also creates that really nice, smooth, pigeon-chested look. Yeah, so that was definitely a very interesting discovery. Oh, thank you for that, Mitya. Appreciate that. Oh yeah. Nevis also says, talking about chalice shaped, another term can be wasp waisted, but a very specific shape of wasp. Yeah. Will your next cotta be blue? No, my next cotta is going to be gold, actually. And it's a beautiful gold silk brocade. And I'm going to be embroidering some of the pattern, or silk damask. And I'm going to be embroidering some of the pattern, actually, or outlining some of the pattern in embroidery for the sleeves. So no, it's going to be gold. Hopefully I'll get that done in time for Pensic. We'll see. We will see. We will see. Okay, everyone. We're coming up to the end of our sewing party for the day. Are there any final questions or comments about life in the Middle Ages, about medieval clothing, about sewing techniques, about crafting techniques? Any videos you've seen of mine recently or posts where you had questions? I'm going to go ahead and open up the floor to anyone. Oh, what is a cotta? Okay, great. Cassandra, good term. Cotta, perfectly spelt, by the way, is the fancy version of a gamora. And the gamora is the Italian version of a kirtle. So it's actually technically an intermediate layer, but it was socially acceptable for cotte to be worn on their own because they were so splendid. But it basically, it's a waisted gown. The skirt is pleated into it. Imagine the triumph of spring with Venus, very famous fresco. Oh God, the artist name just flew out of my head. Very famous 15th century Italian artist. De la Cosa, yeah, De la Cosa, right? Yeah, De la Cosa, De la Cosa's Triumph of Spring, right? All those ladies doing all those flirting with all those men and getting into hinky situations while Venus is there triumphant and all the little bunnies everywhere, right? Many of them are wearing gamore or cotte. Some of them are wearing something, or wearing a topa or giorneo over top of that as well. But it's really technically the intermediate layer. Laces in the front. It's usually the sleeves. Very often the sleeves are different from the body itself, from the skirts and the bodice. And, sometimes the cotte are fancy. They have all the embroidery and all the trim, whereas the gamore tend to be made of wool or linen or hemp and tend to be relatively undecorated. Not so fancy. Yeah. So that is a cotta. And if you look up Florentine cotta, you might actually be able to, you might get some pictures of it, but you might also get, don't rely on AI. Everyone, I'm just going to beg you, please stop using AI for your searches. Don't trust AI results, skim right past them. They are sometimes just right enough to be deceiving, but like very often, if not always, there's some really bad misinformation in them as well. Aside from the, ethical concerns about using AI and all those data centers, the information is just generally wrong. So please don't use it. All my Korean friends are using ChatGPT now for translations, and it makes me hurt. It makes me so sad. Okay, any other final questions? If you've been enjoying, please like and subscribe. I would like to thank all of my patrons on Patreon, my channel members, and my Facebook subscribers for supporting my work. If you would like access to extra footage, to full tutorials, to extra resources, and access to my Creative Contessa Discord server, then consider becoming a patron on Patreon or a channel member. By the way, Patreon is, I get much more of the money you give them than YouTube. YouTube takes a 30% cut, just so you all know. Patreon only takes like an 11% cut. Question. Yeah, AI is the seventh circle of hell. Susan says, how was the Persian dish? It was not Persian, it was Sicilian, and it turned out really delicious. The rumania, the pomegranate chicken that we made last night, and if you want to check out that, the recording of last night's medieval cooking party is up, so you can go watch that next if you're looking for more of me and watching me work my way through an extant medieval recipe and recreate it, redact it, as we say. Yeah, reject all engagement with AI whenever you can. Yeah, Sonia, 100%. I mean, here's the thing, guys. We are letting AI take over the world, and that's not good. We're letting it take over our role as humans. We're letting it take our creativity. We're letting it take our cognitive abilities. We're letting it supplant us. We need to stop this madness. I can make a promise to you. I will never knowingly use AI, and YouTube now has a use AI to edit this video function. And while that would be way easier for me to make my shorts, I refuse to use it. I will not use it. So please don't. Please try to avoid it in any way you can. I know it's becoming almost insidious to the point where the only way to not use it is to live in the middle of the woods off the grid. But try as much as you can to resist. Yep. Okay, everyone. I will have more live streams planned this week. I haven't, probably the next time I'll be able to have a time for a live stream might be the weekend. I don't remember what I'm doing tomorrow. I might do a medieval story time tomorrow, actually. We might have medieval story time come back tomorrow. Anyway, until next time, everyone, please like and subscribe. Have a lovely morning, afternoon, evening, and may your exploration of history be creative. Bye, everyone.